Hi, good afternoon, everybody. I'm just going to talk for a little bit while people are entering our chat room, and I'm delighted that you're joining us today for this session where we're going to talk about what we talk about when we talk about money. So while we're just waiting for people to join, I'll just share the format of the session today. So we've got 45 minutes, of which 30 minutes we're going to enter into a conversation with Lauren and Sharon, who I'll introduce to you all shortly. And then after 30 minutes, we'll have a Q&A session. So please do share any questions that you'd like to ask in the chat. And I know that the Natural History Consortium are also watching that for us and will be signposting us to really good questions. I've been personally dipping in and out of the conference today. It's been really engaging and certainly of high interest to everybody, and it's great to see the amount of engagement we've had on the chat rooms today as well. So let me start by introducing myself. My name is Metcalfe. My technical roots lie in architecture, and I have a background of 25 years in the built environment across architecture, engineering and consultancy. I founded ValueShift earlier in the summer to focus on social environmental outcomes in design and consultancy. My expertise really lies in resilience, and I also passionately believe that our well-being is inextricably linked with nature's well-being. And currently I hold voluntary roles as the advisory chair on the Southwest Regional Board for the National Trust. I'm also a business member of the West of England Combined Authority, and I also am part of a housing task force in the West of England driving innovative housing. I'm delighted to be joined by two fantastic speakers in Lauren and Sharon. Sharon, Dr. Sharon Redrobe, is the CEO of Twycross Zoo, where she has invigorated this traditional business by positioning Twycross as a charity, conservation charity that runs the zoo and launching an ambitious 20-year development plan. Sharon also serves as a chair of Ape Action Africa and associate professor at University of Nottingham. And on 24th of June of this year, the British and Irish Association of Zoos and Aquariums hosted their first ever virtual Zoos and Aquariums all-party parliamentary group. And Sharon's voice represented UK zoos in a powerful speech to MPs on the crippling financial crisis UK zoos continue to face in this time of pandemic. So welcome, Sharon. And then to Lauren. Lauren Burnhill is a responsible credit and sustainable investment professional with experience in design, investment strategy and governance of financing vehicles that deliver positive financial, social and environmental outcomes. Her work in 2020 focuses on gender and climate as integral components of financial markets, not only for impact investment. She serves as a non-exec director of Shared Assets UK and Just Share South Africa, and is an independent member of the Helenos Fund Investment Committee. Lauren brings 25 years of emerging markets expertise spanning 3 countries and 42 countries, and is quite a linguist as well, relevant to our conversation today. So when Savita asked if I would host today, I did initially question why me, bearing in mind I'm not a scientist, I'm not a conservationist or a zoologist. However, I do passionately believe in the symbiotic relationship between humanity and nature, and I place a high value on storytelling, and in architecture, language underpins all that we do. Understanding the language of our clients, our end users, and translating this into the expression of the built form, and also in terms of gaining funding and financing, our ability to storytell is absolutely key as to whether we succeed or fail. But also I'm a mother of a 6-year-old boy who during this time of pandemic has been demanding to know, Mummy, when am I going to go to that place with the birds, by which he means Slimbridge? Oh, Mummy, when am I going to go to the place with the wolves, by which he means the Wild Place project? And then he talks about the apes and Bristol Zoo, and I have to explain to him in COVID-19, oh well, we're not allowed to go visit those places at the moment. And he says, well, Mummy, I can go to Westonbirt Arboretum, why can't I go to the zoo? And it's at that point that I stumble. And he, at his tender age, already understands the climate change and the interconnectedness with nature. his collages feature tsunamis and cities turning green. And the role of our places of conservation and creating the next generation of connectedness to nature is in my view, of vital importance in generating social responsibility and environmental legacy creation. So before we talk about money, I thought we need to just set that in the context that we find ourselves. And I know that in the chats that we've had earlier today, we've talked quite extensively about the biodiversity and ecosystem crisis that we find ourselves in, and that the loss of biodiversity and ecosystem integrity undermines our efforts by 80% of fulfilling the Sustainable Development Goal targets. We need to look no further than the global pandemic caused by COVID-19, a zoonotic disease transmitted from animal to human, to see that the finely tuned system of the world has been disrupted. The World Business Council for Sustainable Development released its issue brief, Reinventing Capitalism, a Transformation Agenda, advocating that now is the time for companies and investors to enter and lead the debate, not just about why capitalism needs to change, but how we go about transforming it. And earlier this week, the Royal Society of Arts have published a report, Seizing the Moment, Building Local Bridges in the Future, and that highlights that the pandemic has impacted and changed the way that local public sector leaders are working together, and a need for closer collaboration, breaking down barriers and integrating services. So perhaps our conversation today can further catalyse this sector in that direction of joint working and disrupting the way in which we seek funding and financing. The World Business Council of Sustainable Development make this statement: the COVID-19 pandemic has made the reinvention of capitalism even more important. It is now a critical part of the way in which we respond to and recover from the global pandemic, not just in order to ensure that sustainable development is prioritised in recovery strategies, but because the pandemic has shone a cold and harsh light on many of the negative outcomes generated by our current model. Companies and governments cannot ignore the vulnerabilities that have been revealed. So if I bring this closer to home in terms of for Sharon and Lauren, Twycross Zoo closed its doors on the 24th of March due to the outbreak of COVID-19 and was closed for 83 days, which I understand was its longest period in its 57-year history. And although the zoo was open for the summer, it barely broke even due to the fact it had to limit its visitor numbers to allow for adequate social distancing. So Sharon, earlier this year, yourself and a number of CEOs formed an informal group that then sought and was successful in seeking emergency funds. Why do you think that mechanism was successful, in having a voice in seeking the funds?
Well, I'd say we're successful in getting what we asked, but it was a great lesson in communicating better what we actually want. So we asked for an envelope of £100 million to support zoos during the crisis, and they gave us an envelope of £100 million. And of course, what we hadn't done is spend the time or think that we had to dictate the criteria. And I think that's what we've been facing and continue to lobby since then. So they've had £100 million pot and hardly given any of it out, because the criteria we feel are, well, for us, we feel unreasonable and unrealistic in how one runs a modern zoo these days. So yeah, a great lesson in communication, I guess. And what we're doing now with our lobbying is saying, well, that's lovely, but the point of the fund was to give it out and support us, and to hear that, well, no one's meeting the criteria, therefore everyone must be doing fine, is not the logic that we are following. We're not all doing fine. We are all struggling. We are very good at managing what we do. And we've had some brutal restructuring of our organisations over the summer. And to explain to the public and government that just being open just meant we weren't losing money anymore. It doesn't mean we lost millions each for being closed nearly 3 months, and then closed again, of course, in November, and then opening into various tiers, as we've heard today, with goodness what impact on our gate. So yeah, it was great. It was great to be heard, and especially the quantum that we asked for. But we anticipated those grants being given out by now, and we anticipated they'd be given out in greater number and greater amounts to each zoo. So we're still in negotiation, I think is the polite version of trying to explain why a simplistic fund that just looks at cash flow, just to get kind of nerdy for a moment, and wait till you've got a month's running costs left and then give you a month's running costs is really not a solution, and certainly not a solution for major charity zoos like Twycross.
Absolutely. And in one of the earlier sessions today, we're placing a lot of focus and attention on our children being the voice of the future and being able to shift the future. But clearly, the barrier that we have is central government and banks and funds in terms of not being connected with the value that organisations like you are, your organisation is generating, this link with health and well-being and science and discovery and safeguarding for biodiversity, you know. So it was interesting in researching for today. I looked at some of the government press releases related to that particular fund, and very little of those press releases actually talk about those values, that value being created. It's very focused on visitor attraction or the role for the local community. So I wonder if that is an area that you think we need to improve upon, is talking about the value creation and that link with our biodiversity, our ecological crisis and health and well-being.
Well, absolutely. We're not visitor attractions. That might be part of our business model, you know, but we have animals, but we have them now for conservation reasons and education reasons, to literally try and save the species from going extinct and act as arcs, and then explain to the public and the children, you know, who are our future conservationists, hopefully, why you should save them. And that usually starts with why you love a giraffe. And then you'll want to save it. So that's in our DNA. That's what we do, and the value of that to the general public, and the well-being of close to nature and forest bathing. All these terms are being thrown around now, but zoos have been doing that for years. That's what we do. We allow you to get close to nature where it's safe to do so. You know, we show you the majesty of big, tall, smelly animals, which you can't get the wow factor from watching it on the television. And then we're actually doing good. You know, we have charitable mission objectives to saving and conserving and promoting biodiversity on the planet and educating the population. Over half of the UK population by number goes to the zoo every year. So we're a massive resource for engaging with the general public that the government can use as a tool to deliver their objectives around biodiversity goals and engagement of the public. And that's how we need to be positioned and seen. And I think move away from the Victorian view of zoos that seems to reside in some back corners and cupboards of Whitehall and government. You know, that's not who we are. We are modern conservation organisations, and the big ones are charities, and we're actually delivering government objectives on biodiversity targets and engaging with the public in many ways. And why should we not have that same level of support that they're giving to arts and theatres and museums? We have the same place in our culture.
Yeah, absolutely. And Lauren, from your perspective with COVID-19, you know, the fact that, you know, as I've said, has made inequalities and vulnerabilities very visible, and has reinforced the health and well-being benefits of connecting to nature. What do you see as the challenges and obstacles to fulfilling this opportunity?
Well, you know, I was surprised at how many of our realities or stereotypes suddenly slapped us in the face in COVID. And things that are not easy to fix, like affordable housing, sort of got pushed to the side a little, while things that are easier to fix, like opening the public parks, have gotten more attention, but with it quite a bit of controversy, because it's become very clear that the people using whatever types of parks, or I think our botanical garden also wasn't allowed to open, the Arboretum was. So people trying to figure out, well, how do I get some breathing room with what's going on, and the health benefits of it. And frankly, there has been a very wide community working on measuring and communicating the health benefits of having green space and fresh air, and how the trees can reduce temperature when there are extreme heating moments. I was waiting to see the next phase of that translating into let's pour money into this, let's figure out more sensible ways to make these things available to the people. And one of the things that holds us back, and to dive right into language, is the notion of beneficiaries. That whether it's BAME or what do we call it, BIPOC, or just less advantaged, less economically advantaged communities, there's a little bit of a narrative of we're doing something for these poor people, as opposed to here's a great opportunity to address inequalities in society and contribute to greater well-being. So I feel like we have a big opportunity because it's hard with health benefits and with long-term education benefits around conversation. It's hard to present those. It's easier to say how many people died than it is to say how many people didn't get sick because of an intervention. It's just harder to do. But we have information on it. So we can take from let's say the health science community and start using that information to communicate a new angle of something that I think we all knew was there, but wasn't necessarily perceived, particularly I think at I don't want to say higher levels, but there's sort of a separation between the bureaucratic world and how it defines goals, and then the actual how we live and behave in real life. In the US, that is the disconnect between our stock market and what's happening in the Main Street economy. And we're seeing a different aspect of that here.
I think there's, may I?
Yes.
I think there's been a squeamishness to talk about money and enough money in those of us that deal with biodiversity and animals and charities and all those sectors that intersect on all those areas. It's almost seen as there's a squeamishness or an embarrassment to talk about money makes the world go round. We need money to be able to do this. I think Lauren just mentioned long term, and of course trees take a while to grow. They are long term projects. You know, animals take a while to save as well if we're talking generations. So we do need long termism, and I think a lot of the problems is that politics can be very short-termism, and they've got their eye on the next election in 3 years' time. But I think that's why us in those industries, I hate saying industry because that's always seen as a bad word like money, but those of us in these sorts of industries need to start having long-term views and talk about the real money that these things will cost, and embed them in the economy. As you know, we can play on these other benefits. I think Lauren was kind of teasing with those sort of, we can subdivide and say, well, what about this subset and that subset? But we're talking about, you know, the whole population will benefit from biodiversity and from us saving the planet and saving the trees. You know, these are serious issues now. We've got a teenager called Greta telling us how serious it is. I think it's time for our sector to step up now, but we need to monetize it. It needs to be part of the economic growth of the country, and be seen to be investment in our future. I see Ellen on the chat is talking about the billions invested in military and not in others, you know, and these are common comments. But again, I think we ask for too little, and we seem to be begging for it. And I think we need to say it's an investment in the future of our economy, of our mental health of our population, you know, in the trees that we end up breathing.
I want to reinforce what Sharon is saying. This issue of long-termism, it is very important in being able to convey the longer term, but it also comes into play quite a bit in terms of financing, because there's, ironically, it's called moral hazard, but that's why the bankers copy each other, because if they do something someone has already done, they won't get in trouble when it goes wrong. But this isn't a commercial venture we're talking about. It's sort of the world, the country. What impact investment had this problem when it got started, we're trained to ask for small amounts of money. What is the minimum amount we can get by? And there's not going to be program overhead money. And it turned out we were shooting ourselves in the feet, because for many funders, we were asking for amounts that were too small for them to be giving, given their own economics. And at other times we were asking not just for small amounts of money, but amounts of money that weren't going to fill the gap we need to get a program out the door. So it's really important that we communicate. I think, Sharon, you touched on this before, where the money needs to go to, and sort of when it and how it might get there. So we talk a lot, the impact world has infected commercialism into this. So user fees. That's a wonderful idea, except you're not going to have user fees until after you complete the project that will charge those fees. And even when the project's completed, it's not like 1 million people will line up on day one. There will gradually be a ramp up of income. And there are regulatory reasons it's difficult for banks to look out over longer periods of time. But when things like microfinance first got started, there were regulatory impediments to doing small unsecured loans. And speaking with regulators, lobbying with regulators, industry groups doing that in a number of countries, it did change. And I'm not saying it was easy, but as long as the money that comes out is structured in a way that organizations can't access or can't repay it, we have a problem. And we can never repay if the cash flows, whether that's donations or user fees or member fees, if that's not going to match whatever money's coming to us, we can't get further. And the thing I want to throw in here is that we need to rethink governance. The CEOs and organizations that Sharon's working with, these are all the groups that have skin in the game for the future of the work they do and the planet. So that a traditional governance, when there's financing involved, is a board somewhere of high-minded people doing something, and then an analyst sitting somewhere on the street looking quarterly at numbers. Looking quarterly at numbers for a long-term project with big non-financial returns is a bad way to tell a success story. And there's also operating and maintenance needs of public spaces and green spaces and community education and other facilities. It should be the local groups who are involved in the governance. And furthermore, I think the finance people need to be paying the local groups for their services, because that should be part of an income stream that supports that ongoing work. It's an unusual narrative to say governance should include the people who are involved in whatever is being offered to the community. But it's one planet. Not only is there no planet B, we have to live on planet A, and we have to live on it together. And I think part of addressing the long-term concern, Sharon, that group is in the position to be sort of the trusted agent, if you will, to be a voice for others, but also to say, listen, we're going to be fiduciary responsible for this, because if one organization runs away with anything, all of us suffer. And that issue of, well, what if we choose one bad egg and it looks wrong? That will hold up a lot of funding sources, but it's partly because they're not day-to-day working with those organizations. It's hard looking at numbers in a resource-constrained entity to decide what kind of risk you think they are. And I think it's now on us to figure out what risks are real, like the loss of biodiversity, sixth wave extinction, and how we communicate that. And I suspect, Sharon, I was watching your video and I'm thinking, I wonder how many of the people looking at emergency funding for zoos and when zoos and botanical gardens and parks should open, how many of them see all of this as sort of bread and circuses for the masses, as opposed to something that's a fundamental part of society? And that's a mindset that's going to be tough to shift. But I think fundamentally, all of the language issues and budget issues come down to, we need to have our values aligned about the why to get the what out.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that I also, picking up on that, was just looking in terms of the audience for the conference today and the members of the Natural History Consortium, is the sheer scale of impact that all of those organisations have collectively, but actually being able to articulate when I've asked, well, what is that value that you're delivering, you know, on a global and a UK scale? That's difficult to get a response to, and yet we should be in a place where we can articulate that really quickly and powerfully. If you just look at the numbers for the BISA, zoos and National Trust in terms of visitors last year, just visitors, it was 63 million. For visitors to our coast, you know, the number of visits to our coastline is 200 million. So there's a huge, huge footprint just in the UK, but also this huge footprint in tackling crises globally. You know, the UK is a pioneer in this field, and yet we don't necessarily shout about it or know about it. And linked to what you're saying about changing this into the long term, which is not just unique to this sector, I see it in the sector that I work in, is that funding and finance needs to move to a long-termism, and insurance also needs to reprofile its risk. And I know some of the sessions earlier today have touched on it, but do we require a change in terms of policy or an act, for instance, a social sustainability development UN SDG Act? We're certainly looking at it for the built environment. Is the one that we need, that therefore links into conservation, that gives a platform for funders and finances to be actually assessing around true value, you know, and that would drive a common language. Do you think, you know, Sharon, is that an opportunity?
It is about language, and I think if we use the language of finance people and talk about, you know, return on investment, I mean, that's what we're talking about. But often, you know, a bank or an investor will want that ROI, the return on investment, is expressed in terms of money. But if we're talking about what we do, which is, you know, save the planet in its broadest terms, then how do you measure that? These things can be measured. I think it's just us all agreeing on the language and what you're doing. So, you know, for us, the return on investment would be, you know, there's a sustainable population of chimpanzees in Europe in case the wild population crashes. Or the return on investment is that we've educated X many school children and we've measured the change in their understanding of the natural world, and we've measured the change in how many of them are actively going to recycle now. Or we've educated kids a bit more formally and we've measured how many of them will now take science on as a degree where they wouldn't have before. So it's kind of measuring, getting money for it, and you know, money makes the world go round. This thing, everything takes money. We shouldn't be shy about that. But then, what's the return on that investment? And being able to express it in non-monetary terms in the first phase is really helpful. There's lots of talk now about social capital as well. We're creating social capital when we do it, and it kind of makes me laugh because it is just trying to use accountancy speak to shovel conservation terms in. But we do need to try and find common language on this and understanding. And I think using terms like you're investing you're investing in biodiversity, or you're investing in the education of children, or you're investing in, you know, things that we can measure is better language and perhaps understandable by people in Lauren's sector, which, you know, half the time I sit here in a bubble going, I have no idea what she's saying. And I think, you know, that's what happens when finance people start. But we conservationists have to enter that world and start trying to use some of that language, but expressing the value that we're going to create by that level of investment that you're going to give us. And I hear Lauren exactly. I think people that are entrepreneurs making widgets, you know, are used to talking in large sums of money because they know what R&D costs, they know how much it costs to take things to market, they know that things will fail, and they can put money around all that. And I think often with conservation programs, we just, you know, we're all paid quite low comparatively, so we're thinking small, we're thinking we shouldn't want to take too much money off anybody, nothing will fail, so we're trying to write a project that will be perfect every time. That's not how the world works, you know. So I do think we need to be a lot more realistic in what it takes to save a species, or to educate a child or an adult into education, or to lobby government, you know, and then express those numbers properly. And talk about them in terms of then the greater good that we'll be delivering for that money.
One thing that I think could be very helpful in doing that, and this gets us a little bit to collaborating and aggregating, many things I've seen don't start with a benchmark. And getting that benchmark, how many children are not having any access to conservation education? There are answers to those questions. And frankly, I think that civil society philanthropies should start with, yeah, we want to make sure you know what the situation is so you can tell us if you've succeeded at changing it. Because it is hard to get the success metrics if you don't know where you started from, and it's difficult to measure. Zoe, you mentioned insurance, and one of the things I've noticed, and it's sort of like a secret, it seems, insurance companies put values on healthy lives, disabled lives, all kinds of configurations of what a life is. They put a monetary value on it when they're pricing policies. And when COVID first started, it turned out that the monetary value that was being placed on a life in some aspect of the US system was $10 million. That if, it would cost $10 million to save $250,000 of us, that's way too much money, die. So insurance company numbers are too big, but it strikes me that if actuaries have figured out how to put a value on a human life, we can borrow the methodology and use it differently. And we're still a lot of in different pockets when it comes to who's developing the language and the metrics and who has the data, because that is another thing that one will hear too often on the finance side. Well, we don't have good data. Nobody had data on whether some subprime mortgages lending 120% to poor people would be a good idea. It was just profitable, so they jumped in. Here, we can't show them that it will be hugely profitable. Survival of the human race should have a higher value than it does. So we need to show the ways in which it is profitable to society. And I'm going to bring a term that we're going to loop in later, benefit stacking. I actually heard this from Mark Walton at Shared Assets, because Shared Assets works on environmental governance and land use, and we've sort of shifted our model to how do we change the ecosystem, how do we build the ecosystem and collaborate with others. And one of the things is, it may be difficult to quantify any and all of the benefits we're delivering to society, but we're usually delivering more than one, and we've been told to focus. So we're bringing the one to the funders and saying, this is the most important thing we're doing. And yet perhaps by showing that there are actually 6 important things we're doing, that this is our baseline and this is where we're going, it could help. I'm not saying everybody's going to just change their minds. Oh, you've given us good data. Now we're going to, Zoe, you sent us a really interesting article on conservation finance. And I've seen some in the US too, this awareness that we don't have good ways for money to flow into things about conservation, biodiversity, shared land use. We just don't have ways to finance it. And conservation finance used to be wealthy people gave money to one of 3 international NGOs to buy big amounts of land that would then not be commercially developed. And that was a huge innovation over commercially developing everything. But what's the next step of conservation finance? And is it the other buzz, because we always label everything natural capital, a natural capital solution. For some people that means forestry, for some people it means landscape, for others it means climate resilience. But maybe we can use it in different ways as long as we define how we're using it in the context we are, and maybe different funding groups respond to different words. So you have a pitch deck for Schroeder's new social capital trust, and that's going to use words that the impact community likes, with the banking thrown in. So the ROI on doing this. But if you're pitching to a philanthropy that has always and only done grant making, you want to use language that will resonate with them. So in finance, we very blithely talk about having different pitch decks, entirely different versions of the story we're telling, with different data and highlights featured. They go to different audiences. Is that deceptive? It could be. It can be used that way. But I think it also highlights this. It's not just one story we're telling. because of the language issues. We have to get past the lost in translation. And maybe we need a mentoring program where we take people from the finance side and people from the third sector and sit them together and say, figure out the shared taxonomy for your organization, where the finance person's goal is to really facilitate communication.
And I think that's right. I mean, I'm just going to move slightly to picking up some of the questions that are coming through, because some of the comments are great on the chat and they link, Lauren, with what you're saying. And Jenny has made the point is, do we think opening our account books as charities, NGOs will benefit despite in articulating return on investment? And I think in part our conversation is answering that, is that in itself on its own is no, potentially, because that's only looking at the operational model of the here and now. What we're talking about is the value creation that is much bigger than the operation of the entity in itself. It's the value that is being created at a planetary level, or it might be a local ecological level. And we need to be articulating that. And picking up on your earlier point, Lauren, it's about having the benchmarks to say, if we don't do this, what that means. We need to do something. If you take the West Country, you know, I used to drive on the motorway as a young person. There'd be flies all over my windscreen. You'd have to spend ages getting them off. Now there's no flies, you know, and if flies were money, that would tell a very powerful story, you know, immediately. So we need to change the lens. I think Bella, which has made a really interesting comment around who's tending to brand themselves as entertainment and charismatic animals to secure public donations and downplay a more scientific narrative might feel like a difficult sell. And that may indeed be the case, and it does, as you've picked up, Sharon, dilute the message. So there is an opportunity here of how we are selling the prospectus, as it were, and who our audience is and what language we're using in the value creation and shifting mindset. Laura Williams raises a really good point around how does the public money for public goods shift in government approach when it comes to agriculture conservation, and the announcement in yesterday's spending review of a new infrastructure investment bank relates to this conversation. I can pick that up if you like, and just you could say a little bit, Sharon and Lauren. I mean, I think that's really interesting because from my background in working in architecture and engineering, what's quite evident is that it's quite easy for central government to understand engineering products. They're normally projects normally quite linear. So decarbonisation and net zero, well, let's have hydrogen as a solution, let's have electric cars. They're tangible, they're quite easy and linear to understand, and we can put money into wind turbines. You know, again, it's easy to understand, the output's tangible. And I think the challenge is that what we're talking about is nurturing our planet, it's nurturing our environments and our animals, which is more complex. But we need to actively engage in translating that complexity into a really strong and powerful language, you know, in a common language. Do you want to add to that, Sharon or Lauren?
I really like Lauren's point of we should get conservationists and bankers in the same room and they should share language. I mean, but that would be excellent, because I think they're often over here, and that doesn't help then setting government policy or anything, because there's such a gulf in understanding of what each is trying to say. I think that would be excellent. I mean, we touched on short-termism and long-termism before, but I think what's coming out when you're talking about linear projects and projects with tangible deliveries is joining up these things as well. So and who's the owner? So I think part of the problem is for global warming and biodiversity crisis is that it's no one's fault, or it's everyone's fault, you know, and no one can fix it on their own, so no one's going to join up and fix it. What's their motivation to do that? And it's almost like, as humans, those problems are too big to fix. We're only going to look at things that are urgent and an emergency and need fixing right now. And I think that's the problem. And the simplistic fix as well of there's a power problem, it must be electric cars and wind turbines must be the answer then. That's easy and simple, and then what's the next problem? And I think as humans, we're not built to think multi-generation problems through. But we're the clever ape. We need to start being able to pass knowledge down generations and think through generations. And not all the quick wins will be quick wins that we will see in our lifetime, or our political lifetime, or our economic lifetime, or our job lifetime. And that's part of the problem. So I think embedding that kind of, I hate to say it again, but long-termism, and taking ownership of some of the problem. What can we do? And then also recognising what we can't. There's only so much you could do from the UK that's going to make a difference. We're part of a big planet. And if China or some other country is still digging up all their forests and churning muck into the atmosphere, it is a tiny drop in the ocean that we do. And then that disenfranchises or disengages the public, who say, well, what's the point? Because it doesn't make a difference what we do, because the Daily Mail just told us another country's doing all this, and it makes no difference. So it really is joined up. It needs to be joined up, and we need to be looking at the bigger picture. But being able to carry the public with us on those small, quick wins that aren't illogical, that can't immediately be pulled apart as a waste of time and effort, but we can see how they stitch together for the long-term good.
So a slightly harder piece, and we have the same thing. We're doing a national infrastructure bank in the US, and I get that in the sense of infrastructure is a great sector to bring in pension fund money, which is long-term money. It creates lots of jobs, and it facilitates other aspects of the economy. But if we're not talking sustainable infrastructure, we are destroying wildlife areas, displacing and disrupting communities, disrespecting cultural history. When we're digging up ruins and putting subways over them, that can kind of be a problem. And so recognizing that wins are needed where there is something that doesn't look like it's right in our space. How, and it's not that every organization should be doing it, but which coalition of organizations should be lobbying and saying, infrastructure bank, awesome, let's make sure we have the community health and well-being aspect of that covered, and the climate-related aspect of that covered, because that's a win we could leverage, perhaps. But public money for public good, we've had exactly the same situation in the US. I don't know how big the defense budget we just announced was, but no emergency COVID relief for like regular people. So there are realities next we're all having.
An imbalance, a complete imbalance. I mean, something that strikes me, if I reflect on history, Britain had an incredible brand reputation in engineering globally for many years, continues to do so. There's a real opportunity for us to create a fear of missing out. If we can pioneer and translate new funding and financing that generates movements in our conservation that's not only just local to the UK, but has that planetary, that wider, broader impact globally, we can bring other nations who are having a much larger impact at a larger geographic scale on the journey. I think there is a real opportunity there. We need to look at it in that way, as a green recovery, as part of the green recovery. Lindsay makes a really good point. I'm just going to change the topic slightly here about how can more celebrities be encouraged to come forward as donors and campaigners for the environment and conservation, to shame the government in the way Marcus Rashford, child hunger? And I think that's a really relevant point. And I was only talking with somebody yesterday about the fact that we need to do that where we use that perhaps are in soaps that are there in the audience day to day, rather than celebrities from natural history itself. What do you think?
I think
Sharon,
it's a great idea. Where are they?
About that.
But yeah. Well, yeah.
Well, we need to seek them out.
That's it.
We need
I
to see. I suppose that's
completely agree.
challenge.
We need, but that's about public engagement as much as anything, isn't it? You grab a celebrity so that you're grabbing endorsement, and you're grabbing people's eyes and ears, because they're going to believe everything the celebrity says. So it's a kind of commercial angle, and it does work. They haven't come out the woodwork themselves. I mean, Marcus Rashford wasn't paid for, or I don't think he was grabbed by any particular charity. That was something heartfelt that he went out with. And we do have a number of celebs of various flavours on the TV and elsewhere that are keen on the planet and conservation, but they're not translating it to money, which is really interesting. And I think it comes back down to that age-old problem of everyone wants to whip everyone up and into excitement about it. And Greta's done a great job with that. But where's the difference? where's the difference that's been made? You know, that needs to be, I mean, Lauren touched on governance, but in its broadest sense, it needs to be legislative change. Really, we need to grab the people with it, but you need the governance structure over it to say we will do this, or companies will have to do this, because at the moment they're just going to chase profit margins, and especially in the COVID environment where everyone's lost a lot of money and it's about protecting jobs, there's a massive risk we'll roll back all the good we're doing with construction and the horror stories of HS2 going through age-old trees and ancient woodland, and that will just continue because, and you see it on Twitter now, people will say, well, that's all very good, but, you know, I've lost my job, or, you know, I need to feed my children, and then people will back away from investing in nature, which is really sad, but it is the way of the world. So I think we need to go above that immediate household budget level where people are going to worry and go up to the government level and say this is really important and has to be delivered by government. It shouldn't be up to individual charities or the odd celebrity having a moment. You know, these are proper government targets that need to be delivered globally. Sorry, Lauren.
I'm going to argue for and against that. Because on the one hand, the challenge with celebrities is who knows them. As a board member, we're always sitting around going, does anybody know anybody rich and famous? Because it's really hard to get to those people. So, and even if you see someone who's on TV expressing that, how would you get to them and ask them to lead a campaign for you? So that is a challenge. I do agree there does need to be sensible government money for civil society, but there are really interesting things happening in crowdfunding in very tiny amounts, precisely because even with budgets constrained, there are things that people really care about, and frankly, beautiful animals tend to be one of them. I mean, in my field, we talk about poverty porn, where we show the starving children. It's so bad. I don't know if there's an animal porn equivalent, but that stuff works. And the UK has actually pioneered some interesting instruments in crowdfunding, some of which have been perverted by non-social uses and non-values uses, but like a mini bond structure where you're raising money generally locally, and you're going to give something other than money as a return on that bond. Maybe you're able to go to the zoo free on Fridays for the rest of your life, sort of thing. And the challenge is coming up with a reward that is meaningful, and structuring whatever the financing is so it makes sense. And it doesn't seem likely, but at Action, one of our main guarantee instruments for working with local banks in emerging markets was a guarantee fund. And an astonishing number of people would not only place $1,000 at a 0% interest rate, but 5 years later, when we were going back to say, would you like to renew? People just disappeared. I mean, it wasn't, sadly, an amount of money they were tracking. And that was true whether they had given us $100 or $1,000. Some people just want to put the money in. Others were especially foundations, very meticulously tracking what interest rate we were paying and when. But in that fund, we just said, we will pay you what you want. Here's the range of interest rates. You tell us what you think is fair. You know, that the first time you do that, it doesn't necessarily work very well. It's like pay what it's worth in a restaurant. A lot of people walk in and pay nothing. But those who support the idea and want to act within their means do latch on to that. So maybe it's a combination of, we are going to tap the public and look, even with COVID, we're able to do this, but there's another component that it really isn't monetizable. There are many public goods in what we're talking about here.
Yeah. Now, I'm conscious, sadly, of time, and we're sort of coming towards the close already now, of just a few minutes away. I know. So I think one thing I think would be great to get feedback from those that are on the chat of, do we need to set up some further conversations to talk further about funding and finance, value and governance policy, and really move from a conversation into action, you know, in terms of being able to articulate the value and shift this. I know in the sector that I'm working in, we're doing that. We're bringing funders, financiers together with supply chain and developers to really shift that model and to challenge it, because there's an element of needing to do that and push upwards into government to say this is what we need to happen. As we've touched on, so we've touched on the need for shifting governments. We've looked at the potential regulation and policy, the need to have an act potentially to shift the change, being better at articulating value. And I really do think there's a huge opportunity in the whole aggregation of what we have and the audience we've had today. There is, as Jenna is saying, there is a real challenge around convincing public of value of long-termism. We don't need it's the sector, it's the public's. Absolutely 100% agree, Jenna. That is where we need to make the difference. So that's great. And Alex is saying, yes, welcome more conversations. So I think what I will do after this session is link up with Savita and see if we can move forward with perhaps, forming some sort of task force with Chatham House rules, and see if we can move this conversation into action. So I'd like to say thank you very much to Lauren and Sharon. I knew we wouldn't have enough time. It was a huge amount to talk about. And thank you to the Natural History Consortium and Communicate for hosting today. Thank you very much. And thanks to all of you on the chat.
Great chat. Great to see you all. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.